The key I never gave back. The rain was coming down sideways when I stood on my son's porch, soaked to the bone, ringing a doorbell I had paid for. I could see the porch light flick on through the frosted glass. I could hear footsteps, and then through the peephole I watched the small circle of light go dark as someone leaned close to look out at me and did nothing. "Daniel," I called out, knocking now instead of ringing. "Daniel, it's Mom. Open the door." Nothing, just the sound of the deadbolt sliding shut, not open, shut. He was locking it tighter, not looser, as if I were a stranger rattling his gate at midnight instead of the woman who had carried him for 9 months and raised him alone for 18 years. My name is Carol Whitfield. I am 61 years old, and that night, standing in a downpour outside my only son's house with a casserole dish going cold in my hands, was the night I finally understood how far a person can drift from the family they built. I should back up. Daniel was not always like this. For most of his life, he was the kind of son mothers brag about at church potlucks. Polite, hardworking, the boy who mowed old Mrs. Petrosky's lawn every Saturday without being asked and never once made me feel like the sacrifices I made were wasted on him. His father left when Daniel was 4, and it was just the two of us after that, 2 incomes worth of work crammed into one, 2 people's worth of love crammed into whatever hours I had left after double shifts at the hospital where I worked as a billing coordinator. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I made mistakes. I worked too much. I missed a school play, a handful of birthdays that ended in takeout instead of homemade cake, and there were nights Daniel fell asleep waiting for me to come home and tuck him in. But I never once made him doubt that he was loved. I built my whole life around making sure of that. He grew up. He went to state college on a mix of loans and the money I'd been quietly stashing away since he was born. He met Jessica in his junior year, and I remember the first time he brought her home, how proud I felt watching him introduce her, how much he lit up. I liked her at first. She was polished, ambitious, the kind of woman who color-coded her calendar and always had an opinion about everything, but she seemed to genuinely care about my son, and that was enough for me. They married 4 years ago. I paid for half the wedding. I didn't have to, Daniel never asked, but I wanted to. It felt like the last big thing I could give him before he became someone else's partner instead of just mine to raise. The distance started small. A missed Sunday dinner here, a shortened phone call there. I told myself it was normal. Married life is busy. New job, new house, and then, 2 years ago, a new baby, my granddaughter, Emily. I thought the baby would bring us closer. For a while, it did. I babysat every week. I drove 40 minutes each way without complaint, folded tiny onesies, sang the same 3 lullabies until my voice went hoarse. I loved that little girl with a ferocity that surprised even me. And then, slowly, the visits got shorter. The excuses got longer. Jessica started answering the door instead of Daniel, telling me Emily was just going down for a nap or not feeling well today, and somehow those naps and sicknesses always seemed to happen right when I pulled into the driveway. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself grandmothers get sensitive, that I was seeing slights where there weren't any. I told my sister Pam this more than once, and she'd go quiet on the phone in that particular way she does right before she tells me something I don't want to hear. "Carol," she finally said one Tuesday in March, "I think that girl is cutting you out, and I think Daniel is letting her." I didn't want to believe it, but that night on the porch, soaked through, staring at a deadbolt that had just been turned against me, I believed it completely. It had started as an ordinary Thursday. Daniel had called me that morning, actually called, which itself should have told me something was wrong, because by then our communication had shrunk down to a handful of text messages a week, half of them just logistics about picking up or dropping off Emily. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that careful, rehearsed quality people get when they've practiced a conversation in their head one too many times. "Can you come by tonight? Around 7, we need to talk about something." I should have asked what? I should have pressed him right then on the phone where he couldn't retreat behind Jessica's shoulder or duck into another room. But I was so happy to hear from him, so starved for any invitation into his life, that I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I made my famous chicken and rice casserole, the one Daniel used to request for his birthday every year growing up, the one that always meant something good was happening in our house. Because some old habit in me still believed that food was love, that if I showed up with something warm in my hands, whatever was wrong between us could be fixed over dinner like it always used to be. I got there at 6:55. It had started raining around 6:30, and by the time I parked in the driveway behind Jessica's SUV, it was coming down hard enough that I had to run from the car to the porch with the casserole dish held against my chest like a shield. I rang the bell, waited, rang it again. The porch light came on. I saw a shadow pass behind the frosted glass, tall, familiar, unmistakably my son's build, the way he'd carried himself since he hit 6 feet in the 10th grade. I lifted my hand to wave, relief already flooding through me. And then the deadbolt turned. At first I thought he was unlocking it. I actually smiled, wiped rain from my face, readjusted my grip on the casserole. But the door didn't open. The footsteps retreated instead of approaching. And through the peephole's small dark circle, I understood with a clarity that turned my stomach to ice that my son had just locked the door because I was standing outside it. "Daniel," I called out. "Daniel, honey, it's Mom. I'm getting soaked out here." Silence. I knocked. I called his name again, louder this time, and I heard, faintly, through the door, Jessica's voice, tight and low, saying something I couldn't make out, and then Daniel's voice answering her, and then nothing. No footsteps toward the door. No porch light going off an embarrassed apology. Just the rain and the casserole going cold against my ribs, and 23 years of motherhood folding in on itself like a house of cards. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 4 minutes. Long enough for the rain to work its way through my coat, my sweater, down to my skin. Long enough for the anger to arrive and settle in beside the hurt. The way a second guest shows up right after the first one gets comfortable. I set the casserole dish down on the porch step. I didn't throw it. I didn't smash it against the door, though God knows some ugly, wounded part of me wanted to. I set it down gently, the way you'd set down something you once loved and no longer had a place for. And then I walked back to my car and I drove home in the rain, and I did not cry until I was safely inside my own house with the door locked behind me, my door, the one I had never once used against my own child, no matter how much he'd hurt me over the years. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. It didn't. Not that night, not the next morning, not the day after that. 3 days of silence. 3 days of replaying that locked deadbolt in my mind, trying to understand what I could possibly have done to deserve it. I combed back through every recent interaction, every conversation, searching for the offense I must have committed without realizing it. I came up with nothing, which in its own way was almost worse than finding something. If I'd done something wrong, at least I could apologize. At least there would be a path back. On the 4th day, my sister Pam came over with a bottle of wine and sat with me at that same kitchen table, and I told her everything. The phone call, the casserole, the deadbolt turning the wrong direction. "You need to find out what's going on," she said. "Not from him, from someone else. Something's not adding up, Carol. This isn't just distance anymore. This is deliberate." She was right, and I knew a place to start. Emily's preschool had a mother's group that met on Wednesdays, and I remembered from the last time Jessica and I had actually spoken like two people who liked each other, that she was close with a woman named Renata whose daughter was in Emily's class. I didn't know Renata well, but I knew enough, the way small towns work, the way you're never more than one phone call from someone who knows someone, to track down her number through a mutual friend from the hospital. I called her, half expecting her to hang up on a stranger, and instead she paused for a long moment and said, "Carol, I wondered if you'd figure it out eventually." What she told me over the next 20 minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own family. Jessica's mother, it turned out, had recently moved to town, quietly, without fanfare, into a condo 15 minutes from Daniel and Jessica's house. And Jessica, apparently, had decided that there wasn't room in Emily's life for two grandmothers competing for the same holidays, the same weekends, the same bedtime stories. Renata told me, gently as she could, that Jessica had been telling her friends for months that she was phasing out my involvement, her words, according to Renata, because her own mother should get priority since she's actually reliable and doesn't work herself into the ground like Carol does. Doesn't work myself into the ground. As if the decades I'd spent providing for Daniel, the double shifts and the missed birthdays and the stashed away wedding money, were a character flaw instead of the reason he'd had a roof over his head at all. But the part that broke something loose in my chest wasn't Jessica's maneuvering. Spouses have always jockeyed for position in a marriage. I understood that even if I didn't like it. What broke something loose was learning that Daniel knew, had known for months, had sat in rooms where his wife talked about phasing his own mother out of his daughter's life and had said nothing. Had let it happen. had apparently agreed that Thursday's talk was going to be him telling me in person that they thought it would be healthier for Emily to see less of me going forward, and that when I'd shown up in the rain, right on schedule, ready to hear whatever he had to say, he'd panicked and locked the door instead of facing me. My son hadn't just let me stand in the rain. He had planned to end our relationship over cold casserole, lost his nerve at the last second, and chosen silence and a deadbolt over simply telling his mother the truth to her face. I want to tell you that I raged, that I called him screaming, that I showed up at his house and demanded an explanation, that I did something big and dramatic that made for a satisfying story. I didn't. I sat with what Renata told me for 2 more days, turning it over, letting the first wave of fury pass so that whatever I did next would come from clarity instead of wreckage. And then I made my next move, the one I'm told that left my son speechless. I didn't call him, I didn't text. I wrote him a letter by hand the old-fashioned way because some conversations deserve more permanence than a phone screen. I told him I knew about the plan to phase me out. I told him I understood painfully that a person can love someone and still fail to protect them from someone else's cruelty, and that I forgave the part of him that was scared and cowardly on that porch, because I remembered him as a 4-year-old boy crying in a driveway the night his own father drove away and never came back, and I knew fear did strange things to people who'd once been abandoned. But then I told him what I was actually going to do. I was not going to fight for scraps of access to my granddaughter. I was not going to beg my way back into a house where I wasn't wanted. Instead, I was formally transferring the trust fund I had quietly built for Emily's college education, nearly $40,000, put aside dollar by dollar since the day she was born, out of the informal arrangement I'd made with Daniel and into a legally binding 529 plan with an independent trustee, my sister Pam. The money would still be there for Emily, untouched, waiting for her 18th birthday. But it would no longer run through Daniel and Jessica's hands, and it would no longer be something they could dangle my access to as leverage, the way Renata told me Jessica had recently started referring to it as insurance that I'd keep behaving myself if I ever wanted to see my granddaughter again. I also told him I was withdrawing the standing offer I'd made 2 years earlier to leave them my house when I passed, in favor of splitting my estate evenly between him and 2 local children's charities that actually valued family enough not to lock a grandmother out in the rain. And then I told him the part that I think actually landed, the part Pam later said made Daniel go quiet on the phone with her for a full 10 seconds before he could speak. I told him that I loved him too much to let him become a man who locks doors on people who love him, and that the door being closed between us now was not punishment. It was a boundary, and boundaries, unlike locks, could always be opened again, but only by the person who'd shut them, and only with the truth, not with silence. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday. He called me that Friday night, and when I answered, he didn't say hello. He said, "Mom, I don't even know where to start," in a voice that cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was small enough for me to actually fix things with a hug. We talked for 2 hours. He cried, I cried. He told me things about his marriage I won't repeat here, and I told him things about raising him alone that I'd never had the right context to say before. It wasn't a magic fix. Jessica and I are still working out what our relationship looks like, and Daniel and I are still rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time, because trust doesn't come back all at once just because someone finally tells the truth. But 3 weeks after that phone call, Daniel drove to my house alone on a Sunday afternoon and knocked on my door instead of calling ahead. When I opened it, he was holding a casserole dish, empty, washed, the same one I'd left on his porch step in the rain. "I should have opened the door," he said. "I think about it every day." "I know," I told him, "but you're here now, that's the door that matters." I let him in. I made coffee. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit, my son sat at my kitchen table like he actually belonged there, not because I'd forced the issue and not because I'd begged, but because I'd finally shown him in the only language that seemed to reach him that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just a woman standing in the rain, waiting for a door that was never going to open on its own. Emily still visits me every other Saturday. Jessica and I have found something like a truce, careful and imperfect, but real. And the trust fund sits exactly where I put it, untouched, growing quietly for a little girl who has no idea yet how close she came to losing a grandmother, and how one locked door on one rainy Thursday ended up teaching her father the difference between being loved unconditionally and being loved without consequences. I still have the key to Daniel's house, the one he gave me years ago for emergencies. I never gave it back and he's never asked for it. I don't use it anymore, not without calling first. But I keep it on my ring anyway, right next to my own front door key, as a reminder of something I never want to forget. The people who truly want you in their lives don't need you to prove it by standing outside in the rain.